Ever since the Snyder Cut was released, a large number of DC fans have been calling for the Snyderverse to be restored. But should Zack Snyder return to the DC universe? Hey everyone, welcome back to our movie news. Zack Snyder is currently working over at Netflix, but that hasn't stopped fans from calling for him to return to DC. Today, we discuss what the Snyderverse is and if it should be restored. If you were to ask DC fans what is the definition of the Snyderverse, you would get many different answers, and that's because as the DC universe and the studio has developed since the Snyder Cut's release, the term restore the Snyderverse has evolved. Some would define the Snyderverse as all the DC films that were directly connected to Snyder's original plan, those being Man of Steel, Batman v Superman Ultimate Edition, Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman 1, the Snyder Cut, and then the line becomes blurry with Aquaman 1. It doesn't have the perfect continuity with the Snyder Cut, but at the same time, half of the Snyderverse fandom see it as canon to the Snyderverse, and the other half don't. So that film is a tricky one. And then you have others who argue that it's only Snyder's DC films that are part of the Snyderverse. Not only that, but to some, restore the Snyderverse means to bring back the entire original slate and to follow Zack Snyder's original story, erasing or ignoring everything that has been created since Snyder and DC parted ways. To others, it means to bring back Zack Snyder to simply create his Justice League 2 and 3 films disconnected from the main DC timeline, and then DC can move on. And then there's the fans who are like me, who want Zack Snyder to return at some point in the future to create Justice League 2 and 3 that fits in with the new DC universe, as in including all characters that have been introduced since Snyder left DC, like Black Adam and soon to be Blue Beetle. So to answer the question, should the Snyderverse be restored, really depends on where you stand with the definition of the Snyderverse and restore the Snyderverse. Which means we will have 3 answers for those 3 definitions. But before we answer that question, we need to go into the evidence for and against the Snyderverse being restored. We start with what audiences thought of Snyder's DC films and DC films since his departure. I want to clarify that we are not competing DC films against each other because we are all on the same side. This is just a simple comparison to see how well audiences responded to Snyderverse films and how they've responded to DC films since he left, to see if his exit at DC has caused an increase or decrease of success at DC. Not only that, but I also want to say that this will be as neutral as possible to ensure we get the most accurate of results. And for the sake of every DC fan out there, we are ignoring Justice League 2017, as the fans, the studio, and everyone involved in that movie want to forget that it was ever created. This first piece of information has come from Rotten Tomatoes, however we are only using the audience score and not the critic score because the audience score is far more reliable and who the films are actually made for. So the Snyderverse films' audience scores are as follows: Man of Steel 75%, Batman v Superman 63%, Wonder Woman 1, 83%, Suicide Squad, 58%, Zack Snyder's Justice League, 94%, and Aquaman, 73%, with an average score of 74.3%. And just for a neutral sake, I will say that Aquaman is both a part of the Snyderverse, but also a part of Snyder's departure, as that way both sides are equal. Since Snyder's departure, Aquaman 73%, Shazam 82%, Wonder Woman 1984 73%, The Suicide Squad 82%, Peacemaker 89%, and Black Adam 89%, averaging 81.3%. So the films since Snyder's departure have had higher audience scores. What you may have noticed is how many ratings each film had. Some had 250,000 ratings submitted, others had only a couple of thousand, so unfortunately we don't have an exact side-by-side comparison. But we can also turn to the box office to see how many people went to watch each movie. Unfortunately, the Snyder Cut cannot be included in this as it was released on HBO Max, not in cinemas. Not only this, but 2 films in this list were affected by studio meddling. Batman v Superman had 30 minutes cut out of it by the studio, and Suicide Squad was majorly changed by Warner Brothers in an attempt to make it similar to Deadpool. The Suicide Squad and Wonder Woman 1984 were both released simultaneously in cinemas and streaming services during the pandemic, so we should bear that all in mind for the Rotten Tomatoes score as well as the box office results. TheNumbers.com states that Aquaman made the most at the box office and Wonder Woman 1984 made the least, and only the Snyderverse films were in the top 5. Other than Aquaman, since Snyder has left, DC has made less at the box office, and we can also see that when it comes to profit, it worked out the same way too. Snyderverse films were profitable, whilst a lot of the DC films since his departure have not been profitable at all. So just based on that, we could argue that the Snyderverse films have been the most successful at the box office, and Snyder should come back. But during Snyder's time at DC, they were using the most popular DC characters, and so naturally has the biggest pull of all these DC movies. Since he left, the smaller characters were brought in, like the Birds of Prey and Shazam, characters who are less known by audiences and actually have less demand than the bigger characters that Snyder used. However, Suicide Squad 2016 made far more than the Suicide Squad from 2021 did, and I know it was released during the pandemic, but Black Widow, which was released just 21 days before the Suicide Squad, made over $200 million more at the box office. Even Shang-Chi, which was released just over a month later, made $250 million more than the Suicide Squad, which means Marvel was still able to make way more money than DC did with a brand new, mainly unknown character. So I don't think the pandemic is as good of an argument as some may use, as Marvel were able to massively defeat DC at the box office with an unknown character. So overall, for me, that would indicate that while Snyder was at DC, they made more money from these DC movies and even did so with the smaller characters like the Suicide Squad. But we should look at how popular Wonder Woman 1984 and the Suicide Squad were on streaming, as they were released simultaneously in cinemas and HBO Max. And we can compare this to the Snyder Cut, which was also released on streaming. Unfortunately, Warner Brothers at the time were very poor releasing how well certain films did on streaming services, which has not only caused a lot of confusing discussion amongst fans, but also arguments as to which DC film did better on the streaming service. So we have had to rely on third-party information for all 3 of these films. According to Samba TV, The Suicide Squad was viewed in 4.7 million households throughout its first 3 weekends, which was better than Wonder Woman 1984's 3.9 million and the Snyder Cut's 3.2 million. But Samba TV is only available on smart TVs and only counts those who allow their data to be shared. So data for all 3 of these movies aren't 100% the final numbers. We also need to put into consideration that HBO Max's availability was different for all 3 of these movies, and so different streaming services were used for different countries that these Samba TV statistics don't have. And with Variety reporting that the Snyder Cut was the 4th most streamed movie of 2021, would imply that even though it may have not done as well on HBO Max, globally it was one of the most successful movies of that year. And with it being a 4-hour-long director's cut, compared to 2 2-hour-long movies, it is far more likely that audiences paused the movie and came back to it at a later date to finish it. To be honest, there are so many different sources out there that claim different things and have different statistics, and there's a lot of if, buts, and maybes with all 3 films. But like I said at the beginning of the video, this is not a competition between Snyder's DC films and other directors' DC films. It's just a comparison to see if audiences responded better or worse since his departure, and with the streaming numbers, the answers are very unclear. So we've used the Rotten Tomatoes audience score and the box office results, and they kind of contradict each other. Since Snyder's departure, audiences have technically enjoyed the DC movies more, but there are 2 things to consider. The first is that 2 of the Snyderverse films were altered by Warner Brothers, and they are the 2 films that have the lowest audience scores: Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad. So their scores being lower than the rest could be directly impacted because the studio negatively changed those movies. So, if Warner Brothers had left them alone, those two scores could be higher and the average audience score could be closer to the score from the DC movies since Snyder left. And the second is that an average score of 74.3% is still very good for an early DC universe. As for the box office, the Snyderverse films have made far more than the films since his departure, with two of them being changed by the studio. So they could have made even more if they were left as originally created, and this is without Zack Snyder's Justice League being released in cinemas. If a theatrical cut of that movie was created and released by Snyder in 2017, and with the upwards trajectory of DC's box office at that time, we could have been looking at $1 billion movie. So even with a slightly lower audience score, with 2 out of the 5 films being negatively changed by the studio, and one not even being released theatrically, I would say DC has been more successful when Snyder was at the company than since he has left. So I don't think the question should be, should the Snyderverse be restored? Because the evidence would indicate that it should. I actually think it should be, how should the Snyderverse be restored? Which I think is a far more financially intelligent, efficient, and interesting question. Now it goes back to, what do we define as the Snyderverse and restore the Snyderverse? Now for me, the Snyderverse is an obsolete term, and I'll explain why. We all know the continuity of DC has been rocky over the past few years, and it has really caused a lot of confusion as to what is canon and what is not. But I actually think it gives a really good excuse to allow the Snyder Cut to be canon to the DCU, and I already see the Snyder Cut as the Justice League film that is canon to the DC universe. Now I understand that some Snyder Cut fans are against that because Superman is wearing the blue and red suit in Black Adam, which to them means the Snyder Cut isn't canon, as in Snyder's original story, Superman wears the black suit until he succumbs to the anti-life equation. But to me, that just gives the perfect excuse to make the Snyder Cut canon, as the continuity of DC's past isn't the strongest, which would allow certain things like Superman's suit changing colour to be acceptable. This also means Snyder can create a new story for Justice League 2 and 3 that no one knows about. We know the story of Justice League 2 and 3 as it was revealed by Warner Brothers, so Snyder could not only integrate the modern DCU into his Justice League sequels, but he could also create a new story about the Justice League taking on Darkseid that no one knows about. So anyway, the reason why I see the Snyderverse as an obsolete term is because I see the Snyderverse as a part of the DCU. It's actually the backbone of the DC universe. Without it, there would be no DC cinematic universe. 5 out of the 11 DC movies are, in my eyes, what people call the Snyderverse, and they were the 5 films that created the foundations of the DCU. Which leads us on to the next question. How should the Snyderverse be restored? So now we are talking about the future of the Snyderverse, or as I see it, the future of the DCU. So the question really should be, how can we make the DCU successful? Which is a really exciting question with many avenues to go down. Personally, I think first, you announce the DCU timeline so far, and this is how it would look like in my eyes. You embrace every DC film other than Justice League 2017, which is obviously replaced by the Snyder Cut, and you then announce the future of the DC universe. What DC needs to focus on is bringing back the big guns. The DC Trinity needs to have a comeback. Superman's been on the sidelines for too long, Wonder Woman has left a lot of fans disappointed since her second film, and Batman's future is confusing. For me, they need to announce a timeline for 2024 and 2025, and it has to include those 3 heroes. And I think Snyder needs to be attached to those projects in one way or another. What I think is missing from the DCU is the tone that Snyder had created and that Patty Jenkins and David Ayer were adding to at the beginning of the DCEU. Black Adam was closer to that tone, but still not quite there yet. So I think bringing back Snyder as a producer could help that tone return. Not as the only tone in the DCU, but it would bring back that tone that I think hasn't been a part of any new DC film. The main thing I think there should be is variety. Something for every DC fan, but a consistent story holding them all together, which is what DC Studios is going to do. Peacemaker Season 2 is set to be filming next year, and so these would be the films that I would release after it in no particular order. For me, not only does the Trinity need to return, but so does Ray Fisher's Cyborg. A brand new regime is in, and a new beginning has been created, so I really hope Ray can return to the role of Victor Stone, and if he can, then there should definitely be a Cyborg solo movie movie at some point in the near future. As we know, James Gunn and Peter Safran are working on a long-term plan, and I think the end goal of that plan should be the Justice League taking on Darkseid, as set up in the Snyder Cut. Yes, it won't be as originally planned, but it's the best of both worlds. We get to expand the DC universe even more, spanning over the next 8 to 10 years, building out character arcs and introducing new characters, and then, when the time is right, Zack Snyder can return to direct his Justice League sequels with a much larger variety of characters at his fingertips. Now, that is just my personal desire for a Snyderverse being restored, but I have to say, those fans who don't like the DC films since Snyder's departure and want it to go back to his style only, you do have some good evidence to back you up. I just think a DC universe that brings back Snyder and incorporates it into the new DCU would be the best way of making every DC fan happy. But no matter what, I think Snyder must at some point return to the DC universe, and I think it will be weaker without him. And if we were just to use facts and no opinions, Snyder returning to the DC universe does make statistical and financial sense too. This doesn't mean I won't support the DC universe if Snyder doesn't return. It just means I think there is a huge wasted opportunity. The only way I won't support the DC universe is if I don't like the new DC films coming out, and we won't get DC films from DC Studios until 2024 at the earliest, so we have to be patient. Which is why DC Studios must announce their 2024 and 2025 plans soon, so that fans know what to expect. To be honest, I think this video has been a very productive and interesting one. We have been very neutral and looked at both sides of the argument. But to answer the question, should the Snyderverse be restored? Yes. Yes, it should. But that is all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe and turn on post notifications so you never miss a video. I hope to see you here again soon, so until then, have a great day. Bye!